Once water enters roots, it moves through plants before the water is eventually lost. The vapor pressure gradient from the leaf surface to the atmosphere is the driving force for water movement through plants. So if you have water that's in soil and you have a root that's sticking in there and there's a leaf up above, there's a potential gradient that is going to drive water into the roots and generally out through the plant and out the leaf if the stomata are open. And the driving gradient is the vapor pressure gradient. And what that means is that the water potential of water in the atmospheres are relatively dry. And that's going to be a very low water potential that then generates a high gradient from the water in the soil out into the atmosphere. And that vapor pressure gradient from the leaf surface to the atmosphere is what drives water through the entire plant. We talk about this as the soil-plant-atmosphere continuum, where essentially what plants do is generate a continuum where they're able to tap water in the soil and have a thin rope of water that goes all the way through the plant to the leaf, where it's then available to be evaporated into the atmosphere. And this continuum is what we think about that runs from the soil to the plants to the atmosphere as driving water through the system. The key here is that unsaturated air, so if it's very saturated, if it's wet out, if it's raining, that has a relatively high water potential. But unsaturated air has a very low water potential. Water evaporates into dry air. And when we think about the rate of water movement through plants, there's two factors to think about. The first is going to be the driving force, which is essentially the difference in the water potential in the air versus the water potential of water in the soil. And that driving force is going to be how hard you're pulling on the water in plants. And then the flow through the plants is going to be dependent on the force that's applied as well as the resistance. And different plants have different amounts of resistance in them that controls how much water is going to leave the plant. A leaf with open stomata is going to have a lot less resistance than a leaf with closed stomata. And so that's one way that plants regulate the resistance, but there are other factors that contribute to the resistance of the flow of water through plants. Now, to begin to think about water movement through plants, we'll start with water movement through the roots. Water moves through roots along a water potential gradient from moist soils to the atmosphere during the day and sometimes to dry surface soils at night. Here's what happens during the day. During the day, for a plant that has roots in relatively deep soil, that deep soil might be at -1 megapascals. And again, we think about -1.5 megapascals to be a typical wilting point, but a number of plants that are drought adapted can get all the way down to -15 megapascals. Incredible tensions they're able to resist and have water move through them at this really high tension. So in a deep soil, it might be somewhere on the order of -1 megapascals. And during the day, when the air is hot and dry, the potential of the water in the air might be -90 megapascals. And so you have this huge difference in tension between water in the soil and water in the air. And if you have a continuous rope of water from the soil to the plant and then to the atmosphere, you have a lot of tension that's going to be pulling on that rope. Now, one thing that's fairly basic but governs some of the most basic movement of water in plants is that roots do not have stomata. So leaves are able to open and close their stomata and regulate how much water leaves a particular leaf. Roots don't have stomata, and water can enter into the root if water is being pulled through the plant. But as soon as that water stops being pulled through a plant, water can also leave the root. In some situations, you can have what's called hydraulic lift. And hydraulic lift is movement of water through plants, and instead of going into the atmosphere, they go back into the soil. And here's a diagram of what happens with hydraulic lift. So during the day, the example that we had was the water potential of air being at negative 90 megapascals. And in the soil, deep soils at least, only negative 1 megapascals. Now surface soils are drier and they're at negative 4, but if you look at the pattern of tension, that this water that's going through root in shallow soils, there's some pulling on that by the dry soils adjacent to the root, but there's a lot more tension being applied. And following the path of greatest driving force, water is going to flow through the plant and out the leaves into the dry atmosphere. At night, the psi of the atmosphere might only be negative 30 megapascals, but leaves have their stomata closed at night. And because the stomata are closed, that pathway is cut off. The resistance is too high. And so in this case, the water potential of the plant equilibrates with the water potential of the deep soil. But if you look, surface soils are still relatively dry. They're at negative 4 megapascals. So the rope of water, there's still going to be water in the shoot, but that water is not going to go out the leaves because the stomata are closed. And instead, it flows out the roots into the relatively dry soil. So it follows a water potential gradient still, but that water potential gradient, the greatest gradient, goes from deep soils to shallow soils through the plant itself. And this is called hydraulic lift. Now the loss of water into shallow soils is not much consequence for the plant. These plants tend to be relatively deeply rooted and have water available to them the entire year round. But hydraulic lift can be a big consequence for shallowly rooted plants, because those shallowly rooted plants don't have access to as much water as the deeply rooted plants, and that water supply to the shallowly rooted plants is really important. And hydraulic lift ends up being a very big consequence for those types of plants.